Thank you for bearing with us on the relatively short-term schedule change. Dr. Sean Kalic is the director of the Department of Military History at the Commanding General Staff College. Before that, he was the long-serving master instructor of the department, as well as many other jobs within the department. As you might guess, he is a specialist on the Cold War, on nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy, deterrence, and many of the other subjects that kind of fall into that. And he has written and published many things, including several books on that topic. So before I continue reciting his entire CV, Dr. Kalic.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. So today we could not talk about Desert Storm. We could talk about the Navy, some submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and some satellites. Before I begin, the views expressed today are those of and in no way represent those of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, and/or CGSC. So we got that out of the way for the lawyers. Okay. What I want to talk about today is, if the theme's technology in war, I want to talk about how we're using space as a military domain. It's a hot topic right now in the military when we talk about multi-domain operations, and one of the hot domains is cyber and space. And I keep screaming from the rooftops, space is not a new domain. We've been militarizing space since the 50s, and it's just kind of status quo now. So how many of you used your cell phones to navigate here today with a GPS? Okay, we're going to talk about really the origin story of that GPS system, which is the transit satellite system, how it evolves really within a need for finding precise fixes for submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SSBNs, and then how that's going to evolve into allowing that system to be open and free from the Johnson administration for commercial air traffic and commercial sea traffic. So we'll talk about the space race, we'll talk about the building of the strategic nuclear triad, we'll talk about transit, and then we'll talk about how LBJ kind of makes a decision to open it up to everybody and then bring it all into one, if that sounds like a plan. All that in about 45 minutes, right? Easy. All right, so let's start with the space race. That when we talk about the space race, we tend to get fixated on what's going on in the Eisenhower administration and really the commercial side of it. Sputnik, right? You have Luna, you have the spectacular U.S. failures until we get our first satellite into space. But this whole dynamic with NASA and everything going on, the reality is there's a second part to that space race that we tend not to focus on quite a bit, which is the militarization of space, which is really what the Army, Navy, Air Force are doing behind the scenes to really leverage space as really a medium for communication, for weather, for gathering weather, right, information and data, for gathering intelligence, for photo reconnaissance. These things are really kind of black programs in the early space race and aren't talked about much. So the space race that we see here and what we'll talk about today really starts out as a black program that's going to quickly evolve into really a white program, which everybody can see. Now, there's always going to be a difference between civilian space and military space. What I'll talk about vis-a-vis the transit satellites is when you're on the military side, the accuracy is 10 times better, 15 times better. On the civilian side, it's good, but not as good as the military. Now, you won't know that until the 1990s when we release everything, but the reality is we'll explain how and why that happens too. But what we want to focus on is, in the space race, we are woefully behind the Russians. Right? If you follow what's going on, really, I would argue from 1946 onward with the first RAND report on the feasibility of a satellite, one of the big takeaways from the U.S. perspective is that the first nation that can put something into orbit is going to have this profound impact on the globe, that their science, engineering, and technology is going to be second to none, and people want to flock to be on their team. Right? And again, working in U.S. archives from the Truman administration and Eisenhower administration, this idea that if you're first in space will somehow elevate you to the pinnacle of science and technology, which there's something to that, right? Because this is a brand new kind of field. And what happens in October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets put up their first satellite, we are stunned by that. Now, the scientists aren't stunned because the reality is there's lots of intelligence coming into the Eisenhower administration prior to the launch of Sputnik in October of 57, that they're testing an R-7 ICBM with a fake kind of warhead on top, and the idea is if they can put a warhead on top of it, you can probably put a satellite on top of it. So like Eisenhower isn't too shattered by it. The public is. There's a huge outcry, the fear of a red moon, and oh my God, the Russians are going to have the ultimate high ground. But the reality is Sputnik is about a basketball-sized object that just beeps. It's just a radio transmitter, right? And Eisenhower, if you go back and listen to his press conference on Sputnik, he simply says, It's a matter of thrust versus weight, right? That they figured out quicker than we did how to put this basketball into space quicker than we did. And he's like, and it's no big deal, right? Well, that's easy for him to say because he knows of all the black programs going on, right? But that's a hard sell to the public who's like, oh, we thought we were going to be first, and it's not. So part of this transit program is going to evolve out of that process on the black side, that Eisenhower knows that the military is working to use space in very specific and unique ways, and not just what he's going to call space stunts. And Eisenhower is adamant about not wasting U.S. money on what he calls space stunts. Like, we just can't beat the Soviets and match them, stunt for stunt, because he's a fiscal conservative after all. And he says what we have to do is we're not in a 100-yard dash, we're in a mile-long run. So we have to pace ourselves and ensure we're kind of hitting our marks and making sure we're not exhausting ourselves by running too fast and too quick. So when we talk about the space race, we're really fixated on, us versus them. And if you look at the early space race, we are woefully behind, which probably won't, I would argue, doesn't change until the 60s when we start getting into the Gemini program and ultimately the Apollo program. Now, that's the civilian side, though. If you look at the military side, I would argue that we are probably way ahead from day one. The problem is the public isn't aware of any of that stuff. So again, that balance between civilian space and military space, and Eisenhower is all about the militarization of space. Sorry about that. At least it wasn't open, right? But the military side is going to be a critical component to this process, and transit is going to be a main element of that, okay? All right, let's talk the starting point of where this transit program comes from and how it really evolved from that Sputnik moment. So what we have here is the launch of Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. And then we have some folks down here from the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, which is essentially an internal kind of research and development think tank for the Navy. All right, so you've heard of the RAND Corporation, right? It's the kind of science and tech side for the Navy, but it's housed at Johns Hopkins University, okay? And the three folks you have there, you have William Geer right here, who's a mathematician. You have Frank McClure, who's the director of the APL, Applied Physics Lab. And then you have George Wiffenbach, who's actually a physicist. And Wiffenbach and Geer are the guys who figure out that you can predict the orbital path of Sputnik by what they call a Doppler shift. And this is kind of the little scheme they come up with, that if you can't see it, you may not know where it is, and if people are freaking out, like, oh my God, the red moon's, where is it? It's going to kill us all. The reality is that this physicist and mathematician is like, by measuring the Doppler shift off a radio transmission, you can predict, if you take into account things like the gravitational pull of the Earth, the drag, all this fun things, all this math that as a historian I don't fully understand, by the way, right? And what they argue is that you have a nice predictive path. Think about like orbital mechanics. This is the beginning of orbital mechanics, right? Now, Frank McClure has been working on some other ideas that if you can pinpoint and predict its path, what if you invert that process? So it's not about predicting where the satellite's going to be or where it was. Maybe it can give you a specific fix on the Earth, which is much better, right? And again, if you're working for the Navy, one of the big things the Navy has to do is navigate across the globe, right? So these three guys really become the foundation of what becomes satellite navigation simply because Sputnik. So Sputnik goes up. These two guys figure out, oh, you can predict its path. Frank McClure is going to produce the idea that, okay, let's invert that idea now and let's work together to try to figure out if we can essentially use this for some specific Navy purpose. And they do. In fact, they're going to submit a proposal to the Navy by, let's see, this happens in October 57. So by June of the following year, they've already submitted to the Navy uses for a new satellite navigation system. They're going to argue it's going to be increasingly more accurate than what we have online. I'll talk about that in a second, which is LORAN, which is a radio location process. They're going to argue you're only going to need one antenna, which is different from the LORAN process, because the LORAN is like radio finding. So you need one antenna, and they typically tow a big, long cable behind the submarine or a ship to help kind of get those low-frequency waves, too. It's passive, which is critical, too, right? So if you're just receiving this signal, you're not emitting anything. So as electronic warfare starts to emerge in this early 1950s, early 60s, it's not a passive system. You're just pulling down a radio signal like any other radio signal, right? It just may be encrypted, by the way. Fourth, global coverage. That if you have satellites in the air, you can have global coverage. You don't have to worry about fixed locations on the ground. Anybody ever use Loran around here, right, for fishing, right? You have to triangulate off 2 or 3 different things, right, and you're kind of fixed based upon where the land signals are coming from. They're going to argue you don't have that problem with satellites, right? You can now, across the globe, find out where you are, which has great appeal to the Navy. The fifth one is one we tend not to think about today. It's all weather capable. That one of the problems with Loran and other systems, whether it's chronographs, whether it's sextants, is they are inhibited by the weather. So in Loran's case, it's also inhibited by geography and kind of, natural landscapes. So again, if you put something in the air, it bypasses all these ideas. And you can use it in rain, fog, sun, thunderstorms, snowstorms, you name it, which again, if you're in the Navy, great appeal. The sixth one is that it's relatively small. The first satellites we're going to talk about, the first transit satellites, are only 50 pounds. Now, they're a lot bigger than Sputnik, by the way. Again, Sputnik's about the size of a basketball. The first transit is probably the size of a big beach ball, like at those, Jimmy Buffett concerts in the summertime, right? A little more complex than those balls, but about that same size, and they have some other things to put on. We'll talk about how they evolve over time. And again, that's an appeal because you don't need a huge rocket to lift it. What you need is a relatively decent rocket, which the Navy's been working on since the 1930s to put it into orbit, okay? So small is significant for them as well. And the last point is that it's all self-contained. You can take these modular kind of reception units, receiver units, put them on Navy ships, put them on Navy aircraft, put them on Navy submarines, and just plug them right into the onboarding systems. You don't have to build a whole ship around it like Loran or some of the other processes. So if you think through these 6 points, by the summer of '58, they were already working on the value of this new system, that it has great benefits over anything we have in the past, which is fantastic. Now, this happens to also coincide with the development as Eisenhower is moving towards the development of the strategic nuclear triad. So we've had bombers in the past that can drop atomic bombs in the Soviet Union, and now we're building land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we're also going to start building submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which are transited around the globe on these things called fleet ballistic missile submarines. The problem with a fleet ballistic missile submarine is you have to know where you are to get a fix to launch your missile, and we'll talk about how that evolves, okay? So it coincides with great moments in science and space technology, but also at the same time you have to understand the strategic context that Eisenhower is moving forward with this kind of integrated system that we know as a triad now, to build a single integrated operational plan, and you're going to use these 3 components or 3 legs of the triad for different rationale and different reasons. The submarine leg is going to be seen as kind of the second strike capable leg. It's going to be hidden and saved away if and when we have to retaliate against a Soviet strike. So it's imperative, number 1, that it stays silent and it stays hidden, because you want to use it for maximum deterrent effect. But the problem is if something's hidden away and silent, how do you know where it is? Which is where transit's going to come into play, okay? So let's hold that, and we'll jump to kind of what else is going on with naval navigation, and then we'll talk about it. All right. Do we have any former naval officers or folks that were in the Navy? All right. Basic seamanship, right? How do you navigate on the open ocean? Very carefully, right? Don't run across any shoals or any reefs, because the ship gets stuck and you get relieved of command, right? So you have ancient ways. You have celestial navigation, right? You have your sextant, and based upon charts, you can kind of figure out where you are with that. But the accuracy it's okay, not bad, but probably not ultra precise. It's also limited by cloud cover, right? And you better have pretty good charts too, and pretty good data on where you are in space and time, all right? The one down below the sextant is a chronograph, which is another kind of traditional way of navigating, right? It's by time, and you have these maps, right? Maybe you've heard of longitude, latitude, right, with times, right? So as long as you wind and maintain these ultra-precise clocks, if you have the ultra-precise clock and you can measure speed and time, it can give you distance, right? And if you combine that with celestial navigation with your sextant, ooh, now you're cooking with gas, right? But the problem is, how precise is your fix? It's pretty good if you're going to do naval gunnery or kind of figure out like where you are in the kind of the world, but the reality is as you move towards the need for ultra-precise fixes, these systems become somewhat antiquated. Now, they don't go away, which is important. We tend to think that as we get new technology, the old technology drifts away. And what I'll talk about is even when they're going to use transit, starting in the early 60s, these systems are still on board every naval ship. So what they're doing is they're using old technology and brand new technology to ensure they're getting the best fixes they can, which is kind of important, I think. The next one is the LORAN system, which is the map and then those two components. And again, LORAN comes online in the late 30s, and it's used throughout World War II. And really is, it's a huge step in technology as far as navigation goes, because what you do now is you have your sextant, you have your chronograph, you have your trusty compasses down there, and now you can have radio location on top of that. But the problem with radio location is it's also inhibited by weather, it's also inhibited by power, and you better have really good maps that kind of can tell you where you are in space and time as you're between the beams. All right, so these are the systems that the Navy is playing with and using up into the 1950s. And they're not going to go away, but the reality is as they start thinking through these ideas about using submarines to launch ballistic missiles, one of the things they start to struggle with is how do you get precise fixes? Now, there's one way to get a really good precise fix if you're in a submarine. You pop up to the surface, you take some time, you use these methods, and then you go back under the waves, though, right? But what's one of the problems with doing that if you're a submarine commander? What's your number one mission? Yeah, run silent, run deep, right? Secrecy, right? You don't want to know where you are. But if you pop up, all of a sudden, maybe the Soviets can find out where you are, and that could be a bad day. So what the Navy's struggling with is how do you ensure you can get precise fixes that are relatively quick and fast, that you can maybe come up to periscope depth. And then once you get that, and we'll talk about transit. Transit's going to start out about 90 minutes for a fix, which is a long time to be on the surface, right? But not as long as some of these systems, right? And then you can pop back down and go. And you can get updates every 90 minutes or every hour and a half, depending on what system you're with. Now, they're going to cut that down to about 30 minutes later as we move through time. So they're working with how to minimize that time on the surface, because that is critical, all right? You don't want to be on the surface, simply because if you're on the surface, it makes a really good target. And if we know the Soviets have satellites, maybe they can see those things, okay? So again, this obsession with really linking space technology with navigation technology, at the same time of ensuring that you have a second strike capable system for nuclear war plans, is all coming to head in this satellite system called transit. All right, let's talk about the strategic leg of the triad here, which I think, well, let me back up. Let me add some detail for you, just to give you some ideas about navigation. So the LORAN system that I talked about gets you about 200 feet, which isn't bad if you think about navigating across the globe. 200 feet fixed, right, which is not bad. The transit system will get that down to 20 feet. So I get it, and then ultimately the first transit's 20 feet. As we move closer to kind of the 1980s, when it starts to get phased out, we're down to about 6 to 8 feet. So if you think about that in time and space, and any navigators in here, right, the longer you go on an error, the bigger that gets. So if you can minimize that error to 60 feet, or 6 feet, to 60 feet, to 8 feet, even better. So again, 200, not bad, 20, fantastic, 6, even better, you know, and then I'll talk about much later, by the 80s, we're talking about like, I don't know, like 1,000 feet, or I'm sorry, like a meter, 2 meters, which is even more fantastic, okay? Now, at the same time, we're also working through ideas about better guidance for submarine-launched ballistic missiles, too. So things go hand in hand, okay? All right, let's talk about some SSBNs and what we're working on. So the first SSBN is the George Washington, of course, right? And after the father of the country. And if you see here, we're working with really kind of second-generation missiles. The first ones were liquid-fueled, which they quickly realized that in tests and trials, liquid-fueled submarine-launched ballistic missiles on a ballistic missile submarine is a huge problem. Simply because you have to come to the surface, you have to fuel the missiles. It's inherently unstable. Things tend to go wrong really bad. The humidity, The dampness does not mix well with the oxidizers, so you end up with these catastrophic issues. So you quickly move to solid fuel rockets, which is much more stable and better. The problem is you still need to come to the surface and launch the missile, all right? And you don't just kind of open up the tube and fire it out. What they're working on is what they call kind of a cold start process. So you have the missile in a big tube, right? You open the door on top of the submarine as it's surfaced, right? You have compressed air that essentially shoots it out up to a specific height, and then it's at that height the rocket motor will take off, and then boom, it goes into its process of ballistic flight, into its target. From launch to detonation, it's about 17 minutes in theory. Now you can play with trajectories and make that faster or quicker, but the reality is getting that process where it launches out cold and then starts is a process, because what do you have to do again? You have to surface, open, right? And every moment you're on the surface and you're not shooting or something is a moment of vulnerability. So we're going to work through a series of SSBNs and ultimately submarines too. We're going to get away from having to surface, but that's a process here. In fact, we'll just walk through. So the George Washington's the first class, which is going to stay online really from, it's going to start its patrol really June 20th, 1960. We're going to build about 41 of these throughout the 1960s into the early 70s. It starts with a POLARIS. The POLARIS right there in the center is the first SLBN. And there's three stages. There's an A1 POLARIS, an A2 POLARIS, and an A3 POLARIS. And they're going to serve from 60 all the way through 71. So a pretty good long service life. The first POLARIS has a range of 1,200 miles, which is not bad, right? It has a circular error probable, which is a measure of accuracy, right? So if you think about 50% of the shots land within a certain kind of circular error, that gives you your measure of accuracy. The A1 has a CEP of 2 nautical miles. Doesn't sound precise, does it? But we're talking nuclear war, though. So how do you offset that? A bigger warhead. And this is what's unique is the first SSBNs and SLBMs are really these blunt, strong instruments that they're not going to be precise nor accurate. It's going to be, you know what, a big warhead, and we're going to do some city busting with this thing, which, again, second strike capable. And that's going to start to become a problem as we move through the evolution of starting to think through just city busting as a deterrent versus counterforce or countervailing or countervalue targeting. So again, the first Polaris A1 is it's Thor's hammer, essentially, right? The A2 gets a little better, right? The A2 range is roughly 2,000 nautical miles, and its CEP is roughly 1 nautical mile. So you're getting better, but again, compensate with just a big warhead, right? And we're talking like 50 kiloton warheads, so 3-4 times the size of Hiroshima. Now the A3 Polaris is kind of the pinnacle of that program. 2,500 nautical mile range, which is even better now. So think through what you've done in 10 years. You've moved from 1,200 to 1,500, and its CEP now is half a nautical mile. Now part of this is transit. And the fact that if you can get a more precise fix of where the submarine is and do your calculations, you can get a better ballistic trajectory to your target. Part of it is also as we evolve guidance technology, that gets better too. So as transit gets better, as guidance technology and gyroscopes get better, the system becomes inherently more accurate. And then when they're more accurate, you can reduce the size of the warheads. You can start being more specific on what targets you want to hit versus, you know what, I'm going to hit Lawrence, or I'm going to hit Kansas, which is kind of where we start out at, right? And then we're going to, I'll hit Lawrence, and maybe you'll hit Topeka, right? By the time we get to the A3, now you can start specifically saying, well, maybe I'll hit, KU, and be pretty close to hitting it, okay? Not bad. That's the first generation, though. The second generation, and again, transit is the baseline for all of these systems. Up until the evolution of GPS in the 1980s, transit is their basic tool for navigation and getting these precise fixes throughout the globe. And I'll talk about that in a few seconds, too. So the second generation are the Poseidon missiles, which they look relatively similar, by the way. They kind of do some different nose cones, but the reality is they're about the same. And they're going to go from the George Washington class, which Poseidon's going to start out on George Washington, and they're going to move to the Ethan Allen class. And they're going to build another 41 Ethan Allen class SSBNs. By 1966, the United States has 641 SSBNs, so fleet ballistic submarines, that are going to carry 656 missiles, which is pretty impressive, by the way. The Poseidon has a MIRV, by the way, which means not just one warhead. Now it has anywhere from 3 to 12. And what I like about, and this is kind of, I guess, morbid humor, but what I like about the Poseidon is they call it nuclear confetti. Because when you put 12 warheads on it, you're just throwing all kinds of nuclear waste out. But you can hit a lot of targets that way, right? So again, technology with transit allows you now to get more precise, where it's not just one missile, one city. Now it's one missile, 12 targets. So maybe a bomber base, a sub base, industry, maybe part of a city. So you can see the evolution, that the foundation of better navigation, more precise navigation, combined with improvement in missile technology and guidance technology, can now allow you to shape and move your strategic plan into a more precise and counterforce targeting. The range is roughly 3,000 nautical miles now for the Poseidon, and the CEP is half of the A3 Polaris, which is now we're down to a quarter of a nautical mile, which is pretty good. The next evolution of the SLBN is the Trident, which comes online in 1979 and is going to hold sway until 2004. It has a 4,000 nautical mile range, and the CEP for the Trident is 1,500 feet. So guidance technology has exponentially improved. Transit system is now on its third or fourth generation by the time we hit the 70s, and you can move that down to kind of what remember the number we started at? Yeah, the CEP was 2 nautical miles, and now we're down to 1,500 feet. So impressive. And that's a generation, right? In fact, it's 10 years. So within 10 years, you shift from 2 nautical miles to now 1,500 feet, which is pretty impressive. And part of that is relying on this new space system called transit as the foundation. And here it is, the transit system. Now, it's interesting in the fact that the first, when you're doing research on this, it's always comical for space, because there's always kind of the first launch, which seldom goes right. And then there's the operational date where it actually works well and everything goes smoothly. So the first launch of the transit system is on September 17, 1957. And if you think through the time frame, so if Sputnik was launched on October 4th, 1957, within 2 years, not even 2 years, right? Yeah, roughly 2 years, we now have an operational satellite navigation system coming online, which is stunning, because we like to think, we live in the modern age where everything, moves super quick. But in this period, I mean, you're moving from sextants, LORAN, right, chronographs, to now satellite navigation. That's a quantum leap in technology, a quantum leap in accuracy, which is, I would argue, quite stunning and quite imperative for the Cold War. The Navy starts thinking through how we're going to use these, right? The idea is you launch, it's not just one satellite. The initial plan is to have 4 satellites orbiting the Earth simultaneously, and it creates what they're going to call a bird cage effect, and I'll show you a GPS rendition at the end. So the idea is you have multiple, think of the globe, and then you have 4 satellites kind of crossing each other at different orbital trajectories around the Earth. And what you're doing is you're taking fixes off each one of those. So you're getting 4 fixes from space to give you a more precise location. Now the problem with the early transit is they can never get 4 in orbit. They can get 3 in orbit, they can get 2 in orbit, but seldom do they have 4. By the time we reach the 1970s, we can easily sustain 4 in orbit. In the late 50s, early 60s, it is really difficult, and we tend to use 3. But 3 is still better than none, or 1. Right? And again, if we go back to LORAN, we're still using LORAN. So if you can combine sextants, chronographs, LORAN, and transit now you can even get a more precise, kind of accurate fix, even if you don't have the 4 system. So think of it through as kind of an evolutionary process. So really, we're breaking new ground in satellite navigation. That's going to take time to kind of improve. And I think we take it for granted now, right? That, if you don't know where you're going to go, what do? Pull up your phone, right, tap it in, and then you have this nice blue line that takes you right where you want to go, right? That comes from this process, right? And it's so easy now. It's stunning how easy it is, right? But this is the era where they're building that thing that we kind of take for granted almost every day. So in the 60s, really 1960 through 67, it's going to be a highly classified military system. It is the deepest black program that the Navy is going to maintain with some help from NASA, by the way. Because what does NASA provide? What's NASA do? Well, yeah, no, it's a good cover story, yeah. In the reality, some of the ways they hide these launches is, oh no, that's just a commercial satellite. Because, you know, it's a commercial satellite, wink, wink, right? But it's really a Navy satellite being launched on a NASA rocket. So this idea of a military space program and a civilian space program, I would argue from the beginning, is kind of an artificial demarcation, that the two work pretty well together. In fact, NASA's even going to use some of the transit technology as a leapfrog into satellite navigation as well. So from 60 to 70, highly classified. It's used on SSBMs, or fleet ballistic missile submarines, and some commercial vessels. They're starting to play with using it on aircraft, but not quite yet, because aircraft can still navigate kind of celestial and maps and time and speed, which aren't too bad. And bombers don't need to be ultra precise because they have big weapons that they can bring on the Soviet Union, right? So you think Major Kong and, you know, and Dr. Strangelove, right? That you can get there. Submarine commander doesn't have those luxuries of, you know, VFR flight plans, right? All right. So they're experimenting, but really this is maintained to be a system for surface ships and or SSBMs. Now, there's a big change in that process, I'll argue, with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, of course, is going to assume the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Johnson is a big space guy, right? He was on the space committee as a senator, as a vice president. He's going to chair it, and then when he becomes president, he's all about it. Now, part of this is where we kind of come back to kind of where we started, the space race, right? That would argue by the time Johnson is president, we are on the verge of winning the space race. Gemini is going really well. Apollo is online, although we're having a few setbacks. It's expensive, but it's worth it, right? And Johnson sees what the Navy's doing and wonders if there's still another way to convince the world that we are winning the space race before we put a man on the moon. And one of the discussions that he has at his National Security Council is, what if we start to declassify some of the navigation satellite systems? Which he says systems, but there's one. It's transit, right? Now there are several satellites, though. And there's a huge discussion that ensues on how valuable this will be, you know, what will we lose vis-a-vis, you know, strategic security. And he says, but listen, if you offer it to civilian ships and civilian aircraft, because we're entering the jet age now, right? It can improve the ability of ships to navigate around storms, right? Because if you combine satellite navigation technology with new satellite weather technology, whoa, game changer, right? And if you can save time and money, right, better for the economy, right? Can you have better, more efficient aircraft routes if you use satellite navigation? So Johnson makes a strategic decision in 1967 to essentially open transit to the public. And he declassifies a portion of the program. And he sells it in an announcement that essentially says, we're going to offer this technology as a benefit for all of mankind. So it's not just for the U.S. It's for anybody, any ship captain across the world. If you want to buy the hardware, you can. Now, let me talk about price of the hardware, number one. And remember, this is $1967, by the way. The first, and this is 67 through 1970, the amount, the cost of getting those receivers, $20,000, which is a sizable chunk of change in 1967, by the way. So again, aircraft and airlines tend not to be real hip on this because, number one, it's more weight, and number two, it's kind of expensive, right? And we can kind of do what we've been doing for quite some time. If you're a ship captain, though, and you get this, right? If you're a fisherman, or maybe you run oil tankers, or oil rigs, great promise, right? You can kind of keep track of where those fishing fleets are and kind of mark them on your charts. Think about, how folks use that to this day, right? If you watch Deadliest Catch, right, that they're always marking their plotters like where the crab are, right? That's what they're tracking through in 1967. And really the first commercial adaptation really is for the sea. But the problem is the cost, which is not overburdensome. In fact, the vast majority of container ships in this period and ships that run oil are using satellite navigation as early as 1967, 1968, which we tend not to think about. We tend to think about it as a 1980s kind of idea, but it's happening that early. The eventual cost of those systems by 1982 are going to come down to $3,000, which is a lot cheaper, right? The benefits may sound familiar to you, and these are benefits that come from the commercial side. Number one, it's all weather. You don't have to rely on, the sextant or your chronograph or Loran, by the way. Number two, global coverage. Well, who would have thought, right? Number three, accuracy. Number four, dependency. That it doesn't tend to go out. So again, if we go back to that original idea from APL, from the commercial side in 1968 up through the 80s, they are screaming and singing the same praises and benefits of transit that the folks at APL identified for strategic use in 1957. Pretty impressive, right? That they maintain that through space and time. Now, on top of this, we're also in the midst of the space race. So I would argue Johnson does this to demonstrate that, okay, while we're racing to get men on the moon, right, we want to demonstrate that we're not losing that race anymore, that we have other capabilities that can be used for civilian purposes. Now, this is the interesting part, is this is where we start to kind of get the shift from civilian and military, is that the civilian uses versus military. So the accuracy for the final transit system is something like 6 to 8 feet, which is pretty impressive thinking where we started with, nautical miles. On the commercial side, it's 200 to 2,000 feet, which is roughly equivalent to Loran, right? But the idea, okay, if you already have the Loran system, it has issues based upon weather and geography and everything. So this can give you a leg up, but again, not much better accuracy-wise. Now, there is an inherent note that the accuracy by ship captains seems to be better than what they're selling it at. So they'll tell you, here's the accuracy, but the reality is they seem to be getting better fixes and more precise fixes than they're getting. And if anybody ever played with the first generation GPS, there was kind of there's a military GPS that we're playing with in Desert Storm and the civilian models, and they gave you this big delta between the two, but the reality is they were much closer than we tended to think, simply because it's hard to decode those signals. Same thing's happening in transit, that they're going to sell you this, and it's not going to be as precise as the transit system, but the reality is it's not going to be as worse as the selling accuracy as well. So you're getting a benefit that you don't know about, okay? And here are the big kind of movers and shakers that are sliding through the civilian usage. Commercial shipping, which they use the combination of weather satellites and transit, which I would argue is probably a huge leverage of space that we tend not to think about, right? Weather, see where big cells are, right? Transit, you know where you are in space and time. Now you can avoid hurricanes, typhoons, all that fun stuff. Fishing boats and private yachts, because the private yachts, who else can afford it, right? Oil exploration, which is pretty significant, right? Geographic research vessels, and ultimately drift buoys. So you throw buoys out with a transceiver on it, and you let it drift through the ocean to get oceanographic data. So really, hard science and commercial value is kind of what they're playing with as the true benefits of satellite technology. So as we're demonstrating this, and again, 67, right, and it's going to maintain itself up through the 80s and the evolution of GPS. At the same time that's happening and starting to kind of evolve on the civilian market, we are still using it for military purposes. The transit system will ultimately be replaced in the mid-1980s with a GPS constellation. It goes through about 4 different evolutions of satellite structures, from its initial operational period in 1960 all the way up through the mid-80s. And it becomes a well-known secret that we have these fixes, right? That we use this for better, precise navigations because the SSBNs are now just hiding out waiting if and when they have to launch. And now you can ensure that they're going to be able to hit their target within 1,500 feet, which is pretty impressive from where we start. So with that, this is what we end up with. This is a GPS constellation. So remember when I talked about 4 satellites and the spider web or bird cage design? The GPS constellations are much more dynamic and complex. But if you look at the way the orbits are built, they tend to form triangles, right? And if you know anything about navigation, if you can triangulate off something, it gives you a more precise fix. See, I probably should have paid more attention in math class, but I became a historian instead, right? But if you can create these triangles across the globe and this birdcage effect, this is what transit was moving towards, but I would argue the technology just wasn't there yet. Transit gives you kind of a rough birdcage. This is an ultra awesome, precise birdcage. So by the time we get to the 1980s, GPS becomes a system that is well used by aircraft, land vehicles, submarines, surface vessels, and then ultimately it's going to break into the civilian market after Desert Storm. So I'll argue that this idea, when you hear it in the news about multi-domain operations and space, this new military frontier, it's not new at all. We've been using space as a military medium for strategic purposes, communication purposes, weather purposes since the 1950s. And the transit satellite, I would argue, is one of the probably best held secrets up until the 80s that gave us an edge that if and when we had to launch ballistic missiles from submarines, we knew where they were, they knew where they were, and they were going to be able to hit their targets within ultimately 1,500 feet. So with that, let me end and open it up for questions.
First of all, I enjoyed your presentation very much. Given how crucial all of this satellite technology is from early on to navigation and to aiming ballistic missiles, my question is, did the naval leadership at the time worry about these crucial satellites being shot down or worry about how to prevent them from being shot down?
I would argue that becomes a later discussion in the 70s and 80s. And really, it starts with the U.S. and Sputnik again, right? The idea is that if the Soviets can control the high ground, how can we ensure that we don't have to suffer the fate of that? Hitting a satellite's kind of hard, by the way. They travel kind of fast, right? And they're at a very high altitude. And that technology is going to ultimately evolve in the mid-60s to 70s. But if you have a constellation, so that's why it moves from 4 to about 8 to 12 to all of a sudden this. That now if you lose one, you don't have to worry about it. It's going to have an impact, but the reality is you have redundancy in the system. Which is also, you always have redundancy with those old systems too, which I always found fascinating, that they never get rid of a sextant and a chronograph, right? And the Loran hangs on to like the late 80s, early 90s, which is stunning. So they always have redundancy. So if and when, but in a lot of the research I've done, there didn't seem to be a huge concern about Soviet ASAT technology. That doesn't really evolve until like the late 70s, early 80s. And then by that time, you have a much more robust system. We also have the Outer Space Treaty, which is in 67 too, which you can't base things in space, WMDs, so you can't have a Star Wars, right? Let's go one up here, and then we'll kind of work our way back, right? Get a workout today. Sir.
When did ballistic missile submarines become known as boomers?
I have no idea. I would assume probably in this era, right? I mean, because submarines have been around, but we're going to transition them from kind of, sinking things to now all of a sudden as a strategic capability. But I would assume it's in that 60s period when they become the third leg of the triad. I don't know. We have some naval officers in the back that may be able to answer that question better than I can. I don't know, Scott or Randy. Well, Randy, you're Air Force, that's right.
What was the total cost of this program?
Oh, that is a great question that I can't answer because it was true, right? Yeah, the way this original system was built was it wasn't, here's the cost of transit. It was, you know, the missile capability was housed here, right? The satellite transceivers were, you know, the receiving stations or in this budget. So there's not an aggregate number. Relatively cheap though, like billions of dollars compared to other things we're spending on. But it took a fair amount of time just to kind of get, well, we're in the ballpark. Not that expensive, but yeah, well, we're not talking trillions yet. So, you know, it's, and again, the system lasts, I mean, we build the system and it goes operational in 60 and it's gonna last until the mid 80s. So by the time we get there, launching satellites has become cheaper. So it starts off as relatively expensive. So, you know, it gets cheaper and easier over time. The electronics get better and they get cheaper. You can make them smaller. By the time we get to the second set of transits, they're actually putting geodetic satellites on top of them. So they call it piggyback. So now you can get gravitational research and data that improves your understanding of the gravitational fields of the Earth. So, and again, those are hidden in some other scientific budget. So there's not one number like it costs this much. It's always pieces and parts. So, good question though.
Where were these used?
They were used throughout the whole globe. I mean, so any SS.
But not in war?
No, I mean it was the Cold War. So. They're being used from 1960 on every day. In fact, when submarines go on patrol, you can get an update every 90 minutes. Standard protocol was they were to get an update. You know, they'd come to the surface late at night, right? Get your fix and go back under, and that would be good for another day, day and a half. So, and they're used from 1960. I would assume GPS is still used today. So it was a continuous. Once you got them online and on orbit, they were a continuous mainstay of the strategic triad system. Good questions. Yeah, I'll let you pick, okay?
Electromagnetic bomb pulses at, let's say, 200 miles or 500 miles up, or a Crittenden-type solar burst head-on. What does it do to this system?
Wipes it out.
For good?
Yeah.
Well, all the way around the globe.
Well, not around the globe. I mean, so you're talking like an EMP strike, right? Yeah, whatever is in that blast radius is going to get fried. And if you think through how we find this out, right, we find this out through one of the Starfish Prime tests where we do a high-altitude launch, and we take out some of our own satellites, and we black out Hawaii for about a week and a half, and we're like, oh, that didn't go so well, right? And that links to Tom's question about ASATs. They are vulnerable, right? As you get further down the line in the 70s and 80s, we're talking about hardening them against EMP strikes. But the reality is that's always one maybe vulnerability, is that in the vacuum of space, if you detonate a nuclear weapon, it will have a profound impact. But you have to get relatively close to them. I mean, it's not like you can just, you know, shoot up into space and hope you hit something. It's not like a shotgun effect. It has to be somewhat in proximity too, because that blast effects will dissipate pretty quick. But you could do it.
Yeah, comment on the vulnerability of these satellites. By opening that up to commercial purposes, people like the Soviet Union had access to it. They gained benefit from it. Therefore, even in the early days of transit, even though the accuracy wasn't that great, they were benefiting from it.
Yeah.
Therefore, they wouldn't shoot it down. That was the theory. And the same thing with GPS.
Yeah, and again, that's one of the discussions when Johnson is thinking through this in a National Security Council meeting. Okay, is this beneficial? And of course, the intelligence community is going to say there is no way we should do this because simply the Soviets are going to steal it or just buy it. Well, I mean, you can just say, hey, I'm a fishing captain. Here's my money. Right, here's my 20 grand. Give me, and then all of a sudden you start reverse engineering, which I'm positive they did, right? And why wouldn't you do it, right? It's part of the espionage game, right? That's another lecture another time. And then we'll go over here. Okay.
Are you willing to take a question about drones?
Maybe.
Okay, and ground combat rather than naval combat.
Okay.
Is the Army open to transitioning from the very expensive drones that we have in our arsenal at the moment to these very inexpensive drones that are so useful on the battlefield in Ukraine?
I would argue, I don't know what the operational Army is doing. I don't know what the schoolhouse is thinking through. And we are looking at what's happening in Ukraine and the idea that you can use kind of off-the-shelf technology and have a profound effect. And not only that, but also 3D printing in the field to develop these drones is piqued our interest. As it would, anybody paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine, right? That why invest, big expensive money into this when you can go and buy a $300 drone and maybe tape a grenade to it and have, some 20-year-old printing parts for it and stuff like that. It makes things so much cheaper. And that's part of war, right? How do you save money but still kill the bad guy?
Elon Musk withheld the use of his satellites in the Ukraine war. How can he do that?
I don't know. There's a reason why I'm a historian. Once I see the national security debate on how and why that happened, which is probably like going to be in 40 years, I can maybe answer that question. But I have no idea.
Isn't there some sort of coordination with all the stuff flying around up there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There is now. Yeah, I mean, this is they have. You've heard of NORAD, right, or whatever it's called now. The modern contemporary version of NORAD also has a straight space tracking component. So as we put more and more things in space, as things fall apart, or as we test anti-satellite weapons, which blow things up, or the Chinese test those, there are clouds of debris that are now consistently tracked. So anything kind of bigger than this is consistently tracked because it has a profound impact, right? Because it's moving, no pun intended on that, by the way. It's moving at 27,000 miles an hour. So just the mass alone, if it strikes something, it's going to be catastrophic. So we are paying attention to debris in space as as we become more reliant on space for communications, for navigation, for weather, you name it, for intelligence. We have to pay attention to ensure that it can't be easily taken out. So it's not just an EMP anymore. Now it's if you just throw a whole bunch of space junk up there, all of a sudden it can just kind of collide with your satellites and blind you in a way. So again, not a new domain, right? It's been around for a while. Now we're thinking through how to really fight offensively in space and maintain the systems that we have, which is different than that. So I would argue militarization of space has been around for quite some time. Now we're playing with the weaponization of space, which has traditionally been an avenue we didn't want to go into. It was always, we could use space for kind of the military purposes, right? Satellites for navigation, communication, intelligence gathering, weather, no weapons in space. And Eisenhower drew that line and maintained that line. I would argue it maintained itself all the way up through the Cold War. Now we're thinking through, possibly we have to revisit that. Simply because as we see what Russia can do, as China, as others, do we have to have the capability to fight in space and maintain our systems, which is, in this area, you didn't have to worry about that necessarily.
At one point, there was a proposal to bury some wires in the Michigan Peninsula for low-frequency communication with submarines.
Yes.
Now, do we still rely on land-based antenna like that to communicate?
I don't know currently, but those low frequency were a backup to all these systems, right? So it's about communication, and that one was about giving the codes, right? That if and when a nuclear war happens, you want to ensure that submarines, if they are still on station, can receive the go codes, right? And that ultra low frequency system was designed to just send that pulse out throughout the globe, and they could pick it up, which I talked about Lorraine. They would trail those big kind of antenna behind them in the sea. They did that for those ultra low frequency as well. They also did it with ICBMs, by the way. In fact, anybody ever been in Whiteman Air Force Base? Yeah, one of those wings didn't have warheads on them. They actually had satellite repeaters that would actually launch and send a satellite. They would give the go codes to the ICBM crews in case the command and control system was destroyed. So the ultra low frequency was for the submarines. The satellite systems were for the Air Force. So we had many ways to ensure we had communication with the strategic triad as we move throughout the Cold War to ensure the crews could get the codes if and when they needed them promptly. Any other questions, comments? Well, I kept it on track, which is good. Usually I go way long, so they're smiling in the back, which I guess is a good thing. So I thank you for coming out today. I truly appreciate it, and I'll stay up here if you have any questions or comments.